Hi everyone and welcome to Riskologists. This podcast is brought to you by Optimise and hosted by me, Pat Bradshaw.
And me, Nicola Boyle. Optimise are thrilled to host this podcast series where we'll be speaking with some of risk management's most respected and esteemed thought leaders from across the UK and beyond.
Throughout Season 3, we'll be exploring our guest journey within risk management, as well as exploring key conversations and topics around the overarching theme of the season being the future of risk management.
Our goal is to create a platform in which ideas and thoughts can be shared in order to inspire and educate our audience, and to ultimately give back to the risk management community across the world.
So without further ado, let's get into it.
Welcome everyone to another episode of Riskologists. I'm your host Nicola Boyle.
And I'm Pat Bradshaw, and today we are coming in live from the Big Smoke, London, for anybody who's listening overseas and don't know what that is. And we are delighted to be joined by Alan Mosca. Alan, thanks very much for coming on.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
No, it's a pleasure to have you. I think, I think when we jumped into the future of risk management as a theme for the season, you were one of the first names on the list. So
thanks.
I was very flattered that you came back and agreed to do it. I was thought that we were shooting a little bit too high for the stars there, but
why wouldn't I? What, you're shooting high? Not really, but
well, as they say, better to shoot for the stars and miss, but we didn't miss. So delighted to be here in the Ep1 office today. We've done some work with you guys previously. Richard Bendall-Jones has been to our office and talked all things AI, but not gonna spoil it too much for what we're going to discuss today.
Big shout out to Richard though.
Oh, huge shout out! If you've not listened to it, I think it's episode 2 of season 1. Richard joins us, and he's just a fantastic guy.
Great guy.
Isn't he? Hilarious.
Yeah, purely for entertainment value as well. It's worth it.
Cool. So I guess before we jump into it, Alan, I think a sensible place to start is a bit of a journey to date. Bit of a background of your career, your life, your degree. Leading up to this point, you can be as detailed or as vague as you like, but fascinated to find out, so fire away.
Yeah, I'll try and not create any mysteries or anything. I'm Alan. My background is initially as a computer scientist. I worked in high performance computing, so scheduling and cluster management for supercomputers. That was a long time ago. It was already dawn of AI-ish kind of stuff, but there was also a lot of physics and that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And then moved into high-frequency trading for about 8 years, or finance in general, 8 years. I was at places like Jane Street and Market Makers as a quant, which is not a swear word. It stands for quantitative researcher. It's a particular role in quantitative finance.
Just say, is that an in-joke in that line of work?
Sometimes, yes. Especially brokers use it derogatorily.
Yeah.
But yeah, so while I did that, I did a part-time PhD in machine learning theory, which was really a continuation of my part-time masters that I also did whilst doing that, and got to the end of that, and at the time this was true, this is no longer true, realized that there really wasn't a lot of machine learning going on in finance, and I couldn't on my own move the needle in these organizations to shift towards machine learning and AI. Ironically, it's all now gone full circle. Jane Street is actually the largest employer at the large AI conferences, that they actually have an enormous booth to try and recruit people. Yeah. So there's a bit of an irony in all of that. But at the time, I worked my 9-month notice and gardening leave, left, and worked my non-compete at a startup in New York that was doing stream processing. So kind of closer to my high-performance computing origins. But I always knew that the next thing that I wanted to do was found a startup. I did not know what I was going to do, or what the startup was going to be about. I knew that I was going to take some risk. I was in fortunately a position that I had good risk appetite. And this is one of the things, like having worked 8 years in quantitative finance, the R word comes up so much because that is the job, right? Like the job is quantitative risk management. Mm-hmm. And so I knew exactly what my risk appetite was, how much I was willing to put at risk in terms of my time, my career, everything else. And the answer that came out was I'm going to go and join some incubator. And so there's an incubator in London called Entrepreneur First. And because like actually this is relevant for the topic of the podcast, that's also where Nodes and Links came out of. And it's an incubator that just selects people with no idea, but with the right traits and ambition. They chuck them in a room for 6 months, 100 people at a time, turn the heating really, really, really high up, and tell them to self-organize. Go find something to do. Go find some valuable businesses to build. 3 months in, you have to pass an investment committee, so you get investment from the incubator. And then after you get that, you have another 3 months to build more traction, and you do a demo day with usually it's like between 10 and 20 companies that come out of each cohort. And the demo day is in front of usually the 500 most influential seed venture capitalists that are available in the market.
Wow.
So that's
sorry to interrupt. So it's day one. Can that be literally, you want to create a tech startup, but you don't even have an idea at that point?
No, exactly.
Wow.
They'll part of the interview process is they'll ask you what sort of ideas have you been working on. So I had a list of things and list of ideas, but it also gets drilled into you very, very early on that you are almost certainly wrong, right? In fact, all the ideas that I had never even made it to the discussion table, right? But in the incubator, I met Dev, my co-founder, and together we kind of started from a very remote point from what Ep1 does today. And we asked, first of all, what is a problem that is worth solving? And so to rewind time, this was end of 2017, two things were happening. All of the news about High-Speed 2 taking a much longer and costing a lot more was coming out. Carillion was happening. And then there were conversations about Crossrail, but Crossrail still quite wasn't sure. There was a lot of uncertainty in the messaging around Crossrail. Mm-hmm. And so we just looked at that and like, that's a problem worth solving, right? So how can we build something using what we know, which really is like, how do we build software? How do we build AI to address the problems that exist in delivering projects on time and on budget? And then we spent a month and a half, 2 months, literally just asking questions. I had, I don't know how many coffees. Thank God for the invention of decaf. But it would be like 10 coffees a day with people. Asking like, what do you think the problems are? What do you think the dynamics are? And like, what is worth solving that connects to the issue? And there's like a lot of different issues that came up, right? Depending also, like, who do you ask, right? If you ask a risk manager, you get an answer. If you ask a planner, you get a different answer. Or scheduler. I don't know how many listeners you have in the US, but a planner is a scheduler. Or like, that might be actually a separate topic for a podcast. Is a planner a scheduler or not? Anyway, I don't want to enter that debate.
So that's an episode waiting to happen.
Yeah, exactly. You have project managers will have a different opinion, and then project directors will have a different one. Leadership will have other opinions, right? And so you hear stories like, oh, it's productivity, or you hear it's actually the communication of the delays, and there's a culture where like I'm encouraged to hide my bad news until the very last possible moment because the messenger always gets shot, or there's all sorts of conversations like this. And we came within 2 months to a conclusion that sure, all of that is true, and that but is very important because unlike most other things that get done in the world, which sometimes you're like, okay, this is the plan, you describe what the plan is, and then you kind of go and do it. And there is, let's call it a master schedule, which I'm not going into debates whether that is actually works or not, but at least from an information theory point of view, you have an encoding of everything that you intend to do, when you intend to do it, how long is it going to take, right? Yeah. Whether that is correct, incorrect, well done, badly done, doesn't matter. But we said, if you have that, any deviation will be encoded as a change in the schedule, right? So what if we can tell you at the beginning how your schedule is going to change? And that was fundamentally the original vision for Ep1 and how we started. And then I have personally a very big disease that comes from my past in quantitative finance, which is I always talk about risk. So it very quickly then became also about risk management, right? Which is kind of one and the same. Right? If you know that something's going to deviate, that is an expression of your risk. So how do you manage? How do you control that? And we started building software on top of that. And then another next logical step would be, if I can do it for one project, I can do it for all my projects, and I can aggregate everything together, then I can talk about my portfolio or my entire business in risk management terms and like quantitative risk management terms. So that's kind of how it all ended up. That's beginning to end my life story. I will not tell you about my childhood. It's very boring, but
no, love that. Thanks, Alan. And I think one of the questions I just had off the back of that was obviously, well, the title of the episode that we're looking at today is all around a shift in culture, and obviously you guys are getting some amazing kudos for the stuff that you're doing at the moment. Did you find that there was a little bit of reluctance when you first started entering the market, if that's the correct term, or a little bit of pushback, or people were worried about some of the amazing things that you were doing, not replacing their jobs, but I guess the question I'm asking, did you have reluctance from people? Was there an initial pushback versus where you are now?
I wouldn't use the word initial. Pushback is everywhere all the time, right? And it's pretty hard because we talk about something that's in the future, right? So really, there are two dynamics at hand. One is, up until the thing has happened, it is our model's word against a risk manager's word if they disagree. And then in there, you have the strange dynamic of the model has to tell you things that you know, because then it means that you feel it's correct. But it also has to tell you things you don't know, because otherwise it's not giving you any value. And there's a balance in that, where if it tells you too many things you don't know, it gets perceived as wrong. If it only tells you things you know, it's not useful. So you have that strange dynamic there, and that gets torn apart a lot. And then you have the, arguments against AI. I'm going to package that all together. How does it know that my project is different? How does it know that a stadium is not a hospital, and all these things? And I think a lot of it also comes from an emotional place, right? If you think about what is the area of expertise, and this is where I think it's different if you think about risk in finance, for example, versus risk in risk management and construction, where the expertise that people wear as their thing of pride in quantitative risk management usually is the method, right? I know how to model so that I get the best answer from the data that I have. And sometimes we end up in construction risk management saying, I know the things. And that's a big area of pushback. How is this model supposed to know the things that I already know? And I think in terms of culture shift, which is kind of what we're going to talk about, I think shifting towards, I know about the best methods and how to crank the handle on those methods so that with the correct data in, I have the correct outcome, is the important bit. Not, I know that groundworks is usually a risk. Right? Because actually that will come out from the method. So pushback, tons. We still get it every day, right? And now there's even more pushback because we're really trying to push the frontier on what can you do now with the software, with the models. We're trying to build more and more things that kind of look and feel like magic. So that then creates an emotional reaction to people thinking this was part of my job, and that might be seen as a threat, right? And so how do you react to a threat? Fight or flight. And usually fight, not flight in this case. So tons.
God, I knew off the back of this episode I was going to have on the train back up to Manchester. I was going to sit pondering things, but some of the things you've said already, I'm like, God, yeah, it's crazy.
Sorry, and yeah, I'm not afraid of stirring a couple of pots.
No, that's why we were so excited to have you on. I think that leads me on to the next point. I know we've sort of already flirted with the title of the episode being around a culture shift. Sorry, easy for me to say. I guess the question I was going to ask is, for the future of risk management being the overarching theme of the season, and somebody who has so many different aspects and topics and avenues and whatever to go down, when we sort of put it in your park and said, what do you think would be interesting? Why did you land on that culture shift piece? I think we've already touched on a little bit here already, but obviously for the plethora of things you could have chosen, that was the most pertinent from your perspective.
Well, I think because people underestimate the power of culture, also within organizations. And this is one of the things that I've done internally at Ep1 is I've always advocated for culture and having a strong culture, but generally within disciplines, within organizations, within different groups, right? And you get this even in football teams. Like culture is the thing that dictates how people are going to behave, right? Process is always a consequence of culture. So if you look at a lot of the dysfunctions today in projects, a lot of those are going to be just because you're talking about people with certain sets of cultures, with certain sets of behaviors and the certain defined culture interacting with a different set of people with a different culture, right? Like this is where you have, a lot of people talk about the divide between contractors and owners. Well, that's because you have two different organizations trying to work together with fundamentally different cultures, and the interface between those two cultures is a contract, right? It then is sort of natural that the only thing that can happen from that, when you have a rigid contract in place that dictates how those two cultures interface, and one culture doesn't quite trust the other, and it's mutual usually, that you end up in a culture of litigation, finger pointing, and I told you so, or you never told me, or this is a surprise, whatever, right? Which then I think originates all the other dysfunctions. And because, quite frankly, it's all about people, then it can only be about culture. Because that's all you get when you have groups of people. The only thing that you can do is manage the culture.
Yeah. I was going to say, I think I've mentioned this a few times on the podcast, like day one of our training internally at Optimizers, you've got all of these in sort of constituent parts of the wheel in ISO 31000. We're taught right off day one, human and cultural factors over everything else. And it's really, not that I needed to hear it, but it's fascinating to hear it from someone such as yourself, like best person in the room, best available information, or not necessarily best available information, but best sort of technology and things like that. It's always still landing on human and cultural factors.
Always, yeah. Because ultimately as well, there will be someone in a decision chain who makes a call, and the culture influences how they make that call. Whether it's culture coming from the top or culture coming from the bottom, right? If you think of, I don't know, a project manager deciding to make certain changes, right? Or a risk manager deciding what to communicate. That's going to be different based on, like, take the same person, put him in different cultures. That behavior is going to be different.
Yeah. It reminds me of that. I think it's like ABC. I think I read somewhere, attitude leads to behavior, leads to culture, and it's sort of an iterative process round and round. Yeah.
Cool. Just sort of like jumping straight in then to AI is here. And it has been for a lot longer than people probably think. For example, like sat navs, or not even that long ago, a few years ago, Alexa was like the biggest thing, and obviously all these sort of AI machines that people aren't probably aware of. So obviously there's this steep upwards curve of over the last couple of years. And as I mentioned about the sat nav as a point of reference, because obviously some people might be pretty reluctant to accept that AI is here, or they're a bit worried about it. So how can organisations get on board and effectively integrate AI into their risk management strategies? Because again, it's probably a bit of that culture aspect as well, as people are a bit wary of it.
Yeah, it's a lovely question. It's one that's really, really hard to unpack, right? So maybe I'll start with like a funny anecdote. So back in, when was it launched? It must have been 2014, 2015, right? When the first Amazon Echo came out.
Yeah.
For about a year, it was only in the US. And I became known as the guy amongst my circle of friends and family, as the guy who, because I traveled to the US a lot, who would always come back with 5 or 6 Amazon Echoes that I smuggle to my friends and family. Because it was so exciting, right?
Yeah.
And if you think about it, like, you know, Transformers didn't exist at the time, right? So there was no real Transformer-like intelligence that could answer your questions. Voice synthesis was so far behind what we have today. The fact that they could build like such a natural interface back then is incredible, right? It felt like magic, even though like it couldn't do a lot of things, right? I mean, like, sure, Alexa, what's the weather? Or Alexa, turn the lights on. Thank you, great. I don't have to press a switch or pull my phone out. And it was a convenience, right? It didn't.
Yeah.
It wouldn't do things such as, I don't know, Alexa, please get back to this email about scheduling a podcast recording, kind of thing, right? And I promise you, Alex, our EA, is a real person, even though the name is very close. She's a real and lovely person. But there's all this this novelty that came with it, right? And it felt like magic, and a lot of people were very interested. And what I'm getting at is, there's also, for every person that wanted an Amazon Echo, there were 9 who were, I don't want a microphone in my house.
Yeah.
Right? And I think eventually we now got used to the fact that you can talk to your watch, right? And order a pizza or something. So there's a bit of just let the adoption process work. So there's time is the main ingredient here, as well as, you know, improvement in the technology, because when the first Amazon Echo came out, you couldn't order a pizza on it, and then people built apps and build an ecosystem and all these things, right? So you need an ecosystem that is functional, delivers more and more value over time. So this is on the provider's end, right? On the adopter's end, really what you're going to do is keep an open mind, right? And I see this so much now, where every single organization leader gets told, you need to have an AI strategy. What's your AI strategy? It's the most common thing, right? This is why so many publications like The Economist, etc., just keep writing about AI strategy. And usually what that translates into is, I need to hire a chief data officer, and the chief data officer hires a bunch of data scientists and a bunch of ML engineers, and they're like, go figure out something. And the reality is that, sure, that could be a way of doing things. That's what a lot of people are doing. But that isn't strategy, first of all. And second, if you just replace AI with anything else, right? If you say, actually, you know, drawing things manually is over, and we need a strategy for how we're going to use CAD software, you're not going to hire a bunch of software developers to build you some CAD software, right? What you're going to do is you're probably going to get some consultants in, or someone to help you figure out, how do we use CAD? And how does that permeate the critical path of the business, right? Rather than doing it on the side, off the critical path, and then having an internal conflict with the team that's building an innovation, and and they're trying to push it onto the rest of the organization, and the rest of the organization then has a conflict with them because they're trying to push back because we've got stuff to do. So really, it also probably ends up being cheaper, because you're buying things off the shelf as much as you can. And I think that's probably where I would encourage most people to go. Obviously, I have a vested interest in this. But, is there really any point in, if we're talking about risk, right? If we're talking about risk, is there really any point in hiring a team of data scientists to go build a model that can do modeling of variation of duration of activities and then put it into a Monte Carlo simulation, right? Or can you use that budget that you would have allocated to that to hire more or better risk managers who can make better decisions based off of the output that they get from software that you bought off the shelf? Sure, set some of that budget aside to buy the software off the shelf, though. But
yeah, no, that's really interesting. So, in terms of like the three, so did you say, just reflecting back on what you said, there's three ingredients really. There's time, there's the sort of incremental tech advancements, and then there's just having an open mind. Of those three, which do you think are the most important? Because I guess time and open-mindedness, is that if that's a word, to me feels sort of quite interlinked, because it feels like that time enables you to be more open-minded, and in parallel those incremental tech advances are going to be going along that journey anyway.
Yeah, I think, and you've nailed it, right? The causal link is time to everything else. So the core ingredient here is time. Same as cars, same as everything else, right? People would not get on a flight in the 1950s, and now everybody flies everywhere.
Yeah. It's about trust as well, isn't it? We spoke with Matt on one of the episodes, Matt Livingston, about trust, and it's one of those things we mentioned sat-navs earlier. You wouldn't necessarily use a TomTom because it'd take you via a canyon or via a field to get somewhere. And people are like, well, I'm not going to do it because it's pointless. Whereas when you're actually using technology now, which you can build up a bit more trust with, then do you think, is that a form?
No, you're absolutely right. Like, I mean, it's a stereotype, right? It's a stereotype from the 90s maybe, but it's still a stereotype. Like the dad that refuses to use the sat nav. Like my dad still uses a sat nav and refuses to use Google Maps. It's like, how does it know? It's like, it's the same exact technology. In fact, this one knows about traffic. Your sat nav from 1984 doesn't, right? But it is that kind of problem, right? Where over time, the adoption curve changes. And with sat navs as well, if you recall, I mean, maybe you're too young for this. I definitely recall this. But there used to be so many news articles, right? This guy followed their GPS and ended up in a river. And I'm like, first of all, if you're driving towards a river, you should brake before you go in it, right? But second, that's one story out of how many journeys that have been done successfully and faster with sat nav. But there's one story, and that story is scary. And therefore it gets used as the straw man argument for sat navs don't work, which then reinforces my dad, or the stereotype dad of I'm not going to use a sat nav.
Yeah. So just talking on the sort of that time element then. So obviously technologies are rapidly advancing. So for example, say in the next 5 years, how do you think businesses as well as individuals sort of transform into those changes, and how are they expected to go along with it?
I don't know about whether it's going to be 5 years, but one of the things that I strongly believe in is that SaaS is dead. So you won't be using so much the act of logging into things. Yeah. Right? And God, do I hope someone comes along and replaces P6 for this, for example. But instead, you'll have some form of more natural interface with software that can do things. There's a wonderful analogy that I'm gonna steal from a book from I can't remember the name of the book, but the author is Shelley Rose Chavez, And the idea is, if you're driving around with a bus and you want people to get on your bus because it's so amazing, and inside there's like such a great buffet and there's a disco, whatever else you like, right? And it's going exactly to the place that they want to go. And it's going to be the fastest way for them to get there. If you don't drive that bus to the bus stop, people aren't going to get on it. People are not going to chase your bus. And that is a fantastic analogy for communication. I'm going to do a little bit of a parenthesis. I had a couple of conversations with risk managers a few years ago about how do you communicate with your project manager or the rest of the team, right? And one of the things that I heard, this must have been at ACOS-D actually, one of the things that I heard that really disturbed me was when someone says, oh yeah, I'll just send them my thoughts and my report and then it's on them to do something, right? That's a perfectly clear example of not going to someone's bus stop. And, you know, communication gets measured at the listener's ear, not the speaker's mouth. So the fact that you said these are the risks doesn't mean anything, right? You need to make sure that that sentence has entered the ears and then the brain of the listener, which may or may not happen, right? So you need to ensure that that happens. So going to someone's bus stop, back to AI, I think means that, you know, we're going away from interface in a browser kind of thing, and we're going to move to what do people do already, right? So forget computers. What are you going to do if you need something from someone on your team? You're going to either pick up the phone or send them a message. Those are the interfaces that we already use as humans, and so software is going to go there, right? So you'll have effectively a virtual agent that you can communicate to in the same way that you can communicate to your colleagues, so that you can say, hey dude, what's the latest progress report on this section of the project? Blah, 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 blah. You get something, right? How you get that, right? Like email is the other thing that we've already in, right? That's another one of the bus stops, or meetings or whatever, right? And then agents are just going to become more and more powerful to the point that it's not something that you ask a question, but it's something that you give a mission to, right? So you can give it a mission of, I need to look at why my excavation has gone south and it's going to delay everything. What options do I have? And you give it a mission, it goes, figures out stuff, brings back a bunch of data, connects it together, gives you a couple of ideas, and then you are still driving that, but it's done things for you, right? And I think that's where we're going to go. In terms of risk management, a lot of it is going to be about, you know, reporting risk, exploring way more scenarios and options, right? Because like this is the bit that is really important if you talk about risk, right? Risk is all forward directed, right? Everything is about uncertainty, and risk and uncertainty can't really be detached from each other. So the key about uncertainty is that you need to explore as much of that space as possible, because that uncertainty exists whether you know about it or not, right? This is also about like the non-deterministic nature of the world in general. So like everything in the future has a probability distribution attached to it. You know, if I drop this coffee, what pattern will the coffee make on the floor? Has probability distributions, right? It depends on so many variables, and you can get into chaos theory as well if you want. But trying to map as much of that as possible, which is really superhuman because there's so many things to analyze and so many things to look at and so many options to first ideate and then evaluate. So it doesn't matter how many risk managers you hire, you just can't explore the whole space.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we want to go with risk. Like this is where the industry is traveling. And then the risk manager, who all of a sudden is super powered, has so much more to choose from in terms of what change can they affect. Which is really then how do you get evaluated, right? Because like you could be quite literally an oracle, not in the software company sense, like an oracle on the mountain who knows exactly what's going to happen, right? to the point where you tell everyone exactly what day, what time, what minute they're going to die, right? Incredibly nefarious example. But if you know all of that and nobody changes anything, there's no point in that oracle existing. So back to like second problem that we have in terms of pushback is that we're in the business of being wrong. And I don't mean we Eplan, I mean like we in risk. We have to be wrong, otherwise we've done something wrong. Every time you're a risk manager and it turns out that you were right because you said something and that something happened, that means that the other side of the risk management hasn't worked, which is get people to change stuff.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No.
It was mixed with a rant in there.
That's what we're here for. It seems to happen a few times on these episodes.
I can't imagine that people in risk don't rant.
So that leads us quite nicely onto a couple. Well, it'd probably be a nice soundbite of a couple of couple of phrases or terms that I'll be honest, I hadn't actually come across before. It might be more of a shine on me in terms of things that you wanted to discuss before, such as superforecasters and decision making under deep uncertainty, and things like that. And I think just leaning on some of the things that I've read beforehand, that one part of that question around superforecasters is going to be why you think it's beneficial to hope some of your projections are wrong. I know you've sort of already answered that, but in terms of, I guess, just taking it back to layperson speak, for those who, similar to myself, are unfamiliar in terms of super forecasters and decision making on deep uncertainty, could you just take us back to firstly, I guess, what they are, and then in context of people listening to this, likely project professionals, project controls people, what that segue into this is, why it's relevant into this from the conversation we've just been having previously?
Yeah, absolutely. So both super forecasting and DMDU are things that I learned the most about from one of our advisors who I respect incredibly, and she's probably one of the smartest people on the planet. To give you context, like, I think she's now Dean of the School of Data Science at UVA Darden in Virginia. She teaches project management in the MBA course. I'm really not doing her any justice. Her name is Yael Grushka-Cocaine. Really, please look her up. If there's anyone on the planet that all of us have something to learn from, it's her. I learned about super forecasting and DMDU from her, but actually she knows the topic of my PhD better than I do. So this is like how good she is. And super forecasting is very interesting. There's a book. I've made it mandatory reading at Eplan, pretty much because it describes the problem of thinking about the future and projecting, right? So I know that we talk about forecasts and we talk about predictions, but really I think I was talking to someone at Goddard Space Center, of all places, not really much of a professional capacity, it was more a chat, and they only use the word projection internally. That changes actually how you perceive a quote-unquote forecast, right? Because a forecast implies that there is some unchangeable nature underneath by which I make this forecast at this point, and so the outcomes should be distributed on that forecast distribution. Whereas a projection implies that this is only valid at the point in time when it was made. And information underlying that projection may change, which means that projection changes, which actually helps you and enables you to be right in the business of being wrong. But super forecasters, it's an experiment that ran for many years. I do not remember the name of the author. This is a commentary on like really how bad my memory is. The book is called Super Forecasting, so it's very easy to find. And they asked people a number of questions, and these people would have been experts or non-experts, it doesn't matter. It was a very wide study to effectively make projections on a series of outcomes. It could have been elections, could it be like, will nuclear fusion be viable by the year 2050? And they collected all these distributions and they looked at how good are people at making projections and making forecasts. Turns out experts on many things aren't, and this is where it gets misquoted so much, aren't as good, aren't better than anyone else, really, or are just as good as anyone else when the thing being forecasted is a one-off, right? So elections is a good example of this, because you have every election is sufficiently different that it cannot create a learnable data set, right? So if instead you're making predictions about something where you make the prediction, you can know whether your prediction was wrong or right, and that helps you adjust your outcome next time.
Yeah.
Adjust your prediction next time. That is learnable, and anyone can become a good forecaster. And so that's where, becoming a good forecaster means you become an expert. So, like a good example of this, for example, is physics, right? An expert in physics is very much better at predicting what is going to happen compared to someone who knows nothing about physics. Or medicine, actually, in certain terms. Like it's still non-deterministic in medicine because there's a lot of dynamics that we don't understand, but it's verifiable. And, if you're looking at curing diseases, a medicine that will cure the disease for you will probably cure it for the next person, and hopefully it will cure it for me. Maybe not everybody, but you have those patterns, right? And it's effectively like non-random. Whereas actually for things like election, knowing that last time you predicted Democrat and they won, or last time you predicted Labour and they won, doesn't mean anything for the next election, right? So that's why experts can be so wrong as well. But there was a group of people, this is why they're called Superforecasters, who did incredibly well at all sorts of problems. And so the book breaks apart what did those people do differently. And one of the things that they did differently is they changed their mind compared to everybody else. And they changed their mind every time they saw new information, they changed their projection. That's why I like the word projection, because then it turns out that they went very wide with ranges if they didn't know anything, and then they started narrowing them down the more they learned, and it was very much connected to things like growth mindset. And so it's just really fascinating reading. But that also connects to DMDU, and DMDU is sort of like, what do you do in the back of a forecast? DMDU stands for decision making under deep uncertainty. It's a relatively tiny group. I discovered this through Yale in 2018, 2019. And this group has an annual meeting, a couple hundred people. They came out of water management and water planning, of all things. The act of making decisions under deep uncertainty means that you're in a situation where you can't really agree within area of expertise, what is a good model. So you can't really agree how to forecast, is basically the underlying premise here. So what decisions can you make there, right? So a lot of it is actually just about adaptive planning. And this is very true in water. I think DMDU has a lot of people from RAND Corporation as well, which does paramilitary studies about what happens in catastrophic situations. But it is based on thinking about outcomes that are so far ahead that you don't know what's going to drive those decisions, right? But you have to make some decisions now. So with water planning, you don't know how population is going to grow in the next 50 years. You don't know how weather is going to change in the next 50 years, precipitation, all of that. And you have to plan your reservoirs because it's going to take you time to build them. It's going to take you time to fill them. And if you put if the reservoir in the wrong place, it kind of becomes also useless, right? And it's not just reservoirs, there's all sorts of other infrastructure. But it's incredibly interesting because then they go into complete different world where you could say, well, we really need to improve the forecasting. That is one track in DMDU, right? The better you forecast, the better the decision, but then you're kind of in regular decision making. Whereas actually, let's take the forecast as it is and then look at all the possible outcomes and go impact backwards. So you look at what are the impacts that cause the worst outcome, try and deviate from those. And so you have this notion of pathways. Pathways being like, I start at this point and I'm in this state, and a pathway could be I change my state, so I build a reservoir is one of the decisions that you could trigger to switch pathways. So I have this, or I have this other reservoir that I can build. So if I want, I can build that other one. And you map all the different decisions into this tree of pathways that goes out into the future, and you work backwards into like the futures that you want to achieve, and you drive for those pathways.
Yeah.
And it's incredibly fascinating. We had Carlos and Gerard from Ep1 did a talk about DMDU and how it connects to the things that we do a couple of years ago now, actually.
Yeah, God, that just some of the stuff you're talking about then is again. Sometimes I think that I'm relating to it and I think maybe I'm barking up the wrong tree. For example, on the super forecasting piece, when you said things that they do really well is changing the mind. Is that, again, this might be barking up completely the wrong tree here, but in terms of statistics, when you're accounting for things like variable change and stuff, are those changes in mind made off those decisions? So, for example, you've got 3 doors, you choose a door, they open one and say, this is
your world has changed.
It. And then, okay, I'm going to change it because I get an extra 33% of that decision.
Exactly.
Is that exactly how the process they follow as
That's
well?
that. I think. I mean, for context, Monty Hall problem, right? If you choose from 3 doors, you open one door and there's no prize behind it. You started with a 33%. Now you have, if you change your mind, you have a 50% probability. If you don't change your mind, you still at 33, which is like a very interesting thing to think about in probability. But that is kind of a form of DMDU, right? You map what happens. Well, I pick a door, I open the door. Is it a prize? Yes. Well, great. Congratulations. End of pathway. Desirable future. Good. It isn't a prize. Now I've got 2 doors and I have, and this is important about pathways, like what can you do, right? Because if you didn't have the option in the game show, well, tough, right? They open another one and maybe you won, maybe you haven't, it's still 33%. But you can change your mind. And when you do change your mind, you're making a decision at a different point in time based on information that happened before, right? So you've adapted your pathway so that actually that other pathway wins half of the time, which is pretty weird. It's been tested so many times. It's true. It works, and there's no exception to this. But it is a very basic form of DMDU. Yeah.
Yeah, I must admit, that took me a while to get my head around when I first saw that. But yeah.
Cool. So sort of moving on the conversation then, just like another question that we thought to ask you about was, so sort of in a tech-driven world then, where do you see the speed of change, where the speed of change outpace regulations, sort of how can organisations balance innovation and ethical risk management?
I think it already has.
Yeah.
Regulation will always lag technological innovation, right? Mm-hmm. You can't invent the highway code at the same time that the car is being invented, right?
Yeah.
And you are going to have a few lunatics who drive too fast and smash into things before you introduce speed limits, right? And that is, I think, the correct order of doing things, right? People are terrified of this doomsday scenario. We're gonna get to a point where like AI is gonna annihilate all of us, etc., right?
Take over the world.
I don't think that is necessarily any time in the near future, right? But obviously, like if that ever happens, hypothetically, in terms of pathways, right? What's the DMDU approach here? Well, we don't want that outcome. We have a switch to introduce heavy regulation on AI, figure out what it is. You just need to trigger it before you get there, right? Versus, I think, and this is one of the things that I get frustrated about, like, if you look at meta AI, so, and I mean meta AI in terms of like the feature on Instagram, WhatsApp, etc. Mm-hmm. It's not available in the UK. Why? Because of regulation. And this is where we jumped the gun so hard to regulate things. The European Commission has done the same thing, right? let's regulate as hard as we can, but we also want to be leaders in the world in AI, right? And to his credit, Matt Clifford, who is also one of the founders of the incubator that we came out of, who is now the head of ARIA, which is the Advanced Research Infrastructure Agency. It's kind of like sort of a UK DARPA sort of thing. And he's the guy that organizes the AI Summit, right? He has an incredibly difficult job because the public perception is about, we need to regulate it. We're scared. We need to put brakes on it, right? But that completely shuts down the ability to innovate. So, and it is a difficult balance, and it's difficult act to play. But I think definitely in the EU and the UK, we jumped the gun so hard on regulating. Like the European Commission introduced a law or a regulation where organizations that have more than 50,000 GPUs and build models above a certain size need to abide by certain rules. There's one, right? So they literally introduced a law to regulate Mistral. I'm like, why? Right? Just, first of all, just go talk to them if you're worried. Like, I don't think they have any ill intentions anyway, but it's kind of this, let's try and solve the general before we figured out what the general is, that kind of like makes me think that we're really rushing to things that we don't know too much about how to regulate yet.
So yeah, just next question then. So how do you see AI and other advanced technologies shaping global risk landscape? So are there areas that we're underestimating in terms of its impact?
I think so. For me, the biggest impact that I'm seeing going forward is the step after modeling, right? So the step, or I guess you can also think about the step before modeling. The step before modeling is thinking about, what do I want to model? And the step after modeling is, how do I communicate what came out of the modeling, right? And those things are the next frontier of what's going to get disrupted, so that, reporting is kind of already here, right? So like, if I want to build a risk report, please do not write a risk report manually ever again in your life. We're not the only software company that does this, but you can literally just press a button, right? And you press a button, and then every month you get an updated version of the same risk report, and you don't have to do anything ever again, right? So don't worry about that. Worry about setting the priorities, right? Like this is where what every specialist knows becomes important. How do I fit risk management within this organization? How do I make it so that the project managers make the right decisions and make the right changes? How do I make it so that budget constraints don't have too much of an impact on the future of the project, even though those things are going to happen? So that is more of the important part. And actually, we're all going to get way more time to do that, and way better input data to that, right? And so again, it's going to be, if we're thinking about DMDU pathways, like, sure, if you want to do something, do DMDU. Where we've got a talk at DMDU this year, which is part 2. We called it Doing DMDU by Inception. So if I go out and try and teach everybody, you should do DMDU, this is the pathways methodology, etc., it's not going to work. Because we have methodologies in place, we have a set of things that we already do, we have organizational habits, and we have processes. So the reality is, can we go to the bus stop of everything that's happening today and add the MDU on top? And the inception part is like, people don't even, I guess the cat's out of the bag, but it's always been out of the bag, and we never kept it a secret. But can we incept all these organizations into taking a more DMDU approach, right? Build 100 scenarios. Next time, build 5,000, right? What if you have 5,000 scenarios with 5,000 different schedules with 5,000 different outcomes? How does that drive your decision process as a risk manager? This is where I think the big contributions in risk management are going to be.
Amazing.
Cool. So with all these emerging technologies, new forecasting methods, and the deep uncertainty reshaping risk management, what key steps do you think that organisations need to take now to future-proof their strategies and then create that culture?
Yeah, it's always the same, right? It doesn't matter what the new technology is, right? You need to give people space to experiment and find out what the best ways are. You need to have patience. You need to basically let time do its job, right? And this is where the wrecking ball of leadership showing up and saying, we need an AI strategy, let's hire 5 data scientists and go figure things out, might actually be counterproductive. Let time do its job in terms of like, these are the things that are emerging. Pilot things, like, usually piloting something doesn't cost a lot, whether it's internal or external, right? I'm not saying pilot our software, but pilot all sorts of things, right? A pilot could be an employee had an idea to try something, let's give it a shot on a project for a few months, right? And make sure that, and this is the really, really important part, make sure that successful pilots become part of the organization's culture. Don't ever let a successful pilot die. And I see this happen more than anything else, where people have a really good idea, they go and implement it somewhere, it works really well, it becomes a case study, it goes in it goes in lessons learned. Who reads lessons learned? Nobody, right? And this is like lessons learned. This is where it becomes interesting, right? If you start packing lessons learned into AI agents, then maybe you'll have lessons learned resurfacing and making a resurgence because finally they get used, right? But right now they don't. So make sure that individual who invented that new thing or that new process or that new method has the opportunity to go and make everybody else do it if it works well, right? And that's true whether it's AI or not, I think.
Yeah.
Love that. Yeah, I think it comes back to that little trifecta we were talking about before, isn't it? The open mind, time, the incremental tech.
It's always time.
Tech advancements. Yeah. Interesting you mentioned about lessons learned. Yeah, so one of the other topics we're discussing in a couple of weeks is around lessons learned and why it's always just a retrospective, see what happened, and then no one ever talks about it ever again. And like you say, having those sort of really useful nuggets of information and experience and pilots.
Give them to your friendly AI agent. It'll pull them out when you least expect.
Yeah.
And I'll say, on that project, that time, you found badgers. It's always badgers, by the way. You found badgers, so that caused all sorts of problems. Maybe you should go look for badgers before you start.
Yeah. Love that, Alan. It's been an absolute pleasure. I think, honestly, like I say before this episode, one of the ones I've been excited about the most, and
thank you.
Yeah, I'm actually really relieved that I actually managed to follow most of the conversation because I've said to Charlotte Candy when we spoke to her last week, I was like, God, I'm just terrified. Alan probably one of the most intelligent people I've ever met. I'm just going to sit there with a little monkey in my head hitting 2 cymbals. But yeah, in keeping with riskoligist tradition, we always ask our guests what piece of advice would they give themselves, a younger you, back in the day. If you could retrospectively go back and do that, what would that look like?
It's a very good question. What would I do? I would probably tell myself that time is the ingredient. I've in the past been very impatient and really understanding that because what we're doing is not here's a better widget of something that everybody's already doing, but it's something new, that means that there's a lot of time required.
More than you anticipated.
Yeah. And this is true for anyone trying to enact change, right? This is why I'm saying it. It's not just for me.
Yeah.
But if you're trying to change your organization, your biggest friend is time. I guess paired with effort, right? Like if you just sit there and do nothing, it's not going to change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you just need to have way more patience than you think you have.
Love that.
Cool.
Love that. And then last point, if anybody wants to get in touch to discuss anything regarding M-Plan or just pick your brains on any of the fascinating things we discussed today, what would be the best POC?
Probably LinkedIn. You can also email me. It's very easy. It's alan@mplan.io. I have to admit, I am not the best at replying to emails.
I disagree.
I mean,
We
you
got
see
you
by
on
the
here.
time I replied last night, right? I only look at my emails once a day, and I time box it to 5 minutes, so probably not the best. But LinkedIn, I do tend to doom scroll sometimes. So
Well, I think that's where we collared you in the first instance. So
Yeah.
probably, yeah. It was.
so yeah, we'll whack a link to Alan's LinkedIn page in the notes. But as I mentioned, Alan, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for having us and sharing some of your excellent thoughts.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Cheers.
Our pleasure. Pleasure's all
Thank
ours.
you.
Thanks, guys.
And that's it for this week. If you enjoyed this episode of Riskologists, be sure to follow, Optimise and Riskologists on all of our social media channels, where you can subscribe to the podcast and be notified of every episode so you don't miss a thing.
Please like, share, and leave reviews to help support us and increase our reach within the wider risk community.
And join us next time, where we'll be chatting with another leading figure in the world of risk.
Until then, thanks for listening and take it easy.